welcome everyone to Threads Cultural Conversations. Today's interview will delve into the topic reimagining education. Education, as you know, is evolving rapidly, shaped by technology, global challenges, and a need for inclusivity. Joining me today is Dr. George Day. He is the director of the Center for Integrated and Anti-Racism Studies, and he's also a passionate educator, scholar on race and anti-racism studies at the University of Toronto. Thank you for being here, Dr. Day.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's begin. So your work in social justice and anti-racism focuses on the education system. Why is that important, and why is it an important place to start?
Yes, so to begin, I need to acknowledge the land on which I am, and also the invitation that has been extended to me. I also want to take this moment to invite the ancestors into the conversation that we're going to have, right? And hopefully to be something that we can all learn and unlearn from our conversations. Is very, very important. As many have talked about, education is the ways, the strategies, options, and in fact, sometimes the processes through which we come to know our world and act within this world to bring about change. Education is an important site because it's where we come to understand our communities, we come to understand ourselves, we impart knowledge, we impart skills, we impart ideas, and use these ideas to transform. So if education is a site of knowledge, how we use this knowledge to act, to bring about change is very, very important. And since the question of social justice and anti-racism is key to the way we live our lives today, right? It's very, very important that education becomes an important entry point, right? And so we define this education broadly. It's not just what happens in schools. It's also what happens in the classroom, in the workplace, in the churches. How we come to know ourselves, how can we come to act and live and practice what we preach, right? And so it's very, very important if you're going to talk about social justice to see education as an entry point, because it's about knowledge production and it's about how we use this knowledge to act, transform, and bring about the change that we want. So that's why it's so important. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. What assumptions do you see people making about how the education system works, and how could it be reimagined to be more inclusive, diverse, equitable?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. And one of the things that I always talk about is, from how do we as learners, how do we as teachers, right, begin to reimagine our world as we want it to be, and use that knowledge to transform and bring about the new features that we want, right? So we have to understand what the problem is, right? And I think it's about the values, the beliefs, and the ideas that are normally reproduced and recycled in the educational system, right? There's a need to look at these values, beliefs, and ideas as sometimes it speaks to a particularity, and it needs to speak to a multiple sphere, a multiple places, right? So we need to trouble how dominant values, ideas, and belief systems masquerade as universal in the school system, right? We cannot imagine the world if we don't allow for multicentric ways of reading the world. This is why one of the things that I say, for example, is those of us who talk about decolonization, right? We cannot decolonize simply through Western science scholarship. It doesn't mean we throw Western science scholarship away, no. But Western science scholarship has been part of the problem because of the negation, the devaluation, the absences, the omissions. So if we want to reimagine the world, then we have to look at multiple ways of knowing. So indigenous philosophies, for example, how they become very important. Because one of the things indigenous philosophies talk about is about relations, how we build relations, how we build mutual independence, how we build communities, right? How we talk about ethics and morality. So I use the term, for example, how do we create ethical learning subjects? You cannot talk about reimagining education without raising the question of how do we create ethical learning subjects. That's subjects who take the questions of justice, injustice, questions of racism, sexism, homophobia, other oppressions seriously and deal with it. So we must look at how our school system, right, masquerades as universal. I mean, the whole notion about one size fits all, right, is a problem, right? Standardization recipes, as Levin and others talk about, becomes a problem. How do we create the space to think about other ways of knowing so that we are able to imagine a new world, right? It's about creating the space for other bodies of knowledge, for other values, for other ideas to be part of the conversation. So we engage in critical dialogues with each other and allow us to know, right? This, I mean, one of the things about reimagining, right? It's about even history, right? History is so important in conversations about reimagining, right? We teach history not simply for what we want to know, but we teach history for also what we must know, right? And the must is about sometimes the oppression, sometimes about the omissions, and sometimes the negations. And we should know about this and learn from that mistake, right? If history doesn't teach us anything, then it's no history worth talking about. A history must teach us something. So we talk about this history and work with the lessons. And part of reimagining is seeing the past, the present, and the future as a continuum, not a linear, right? We are not moving from a past to a present to a future. No, 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 no. It's a circle, right? The past informs the present. The present informs the future. And the future is something we live now. We are living now. It's very important for us to look at this in the ways we reimagine our world. And education, if it's about reimagining, it has to be decolonized. And decolonizing education is working with multicentric ways of knowing. It's working to create the space for other bodies of knowledge to come into conversation. It's working to create the space for all learners to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, a sense of identification, a sense that they matter, a sense their experiences, their journeys, the journeys that they have been through, they all count in the way we come to know about our world. And education has a role to play in that. And it can start by troubling, right, what constitutes the norm, what constitutes the values that a learner must know. To trouble that, right? There's no universal learner. There is no universal learner. All learners are demarcated by race, class, gender, sexuality, history, and so forth, right? And we need to look at how the way we talk about education recognizes questions of diversity, multiplicity, contestations, ideas, and how this come into critical dialogues with each other.
That's good. Really, really enlightening. Thank you. All right. So also in your work, you've mentioned the importance of not only including cultural teachings in curriculum, right? But also critically examining them in the classroom. Why is that approach significant? Why is it important?
Yeah, I think critically examining them is that I think it's very important to create a space, right, for every learner to develop a sense of identification with knowledge, right? And one way we do this is we look at culture, right? Culture is very important, right? And culture doesn't mean you don't talk about questions of power. Culture is not apolitical. Culture is about power, right? But it's very important in how we engage schooling, right? And so when we talk about culture, we're talking about knowledges and to teach them critically. Earlier on, I talked about the question of, for example, indigenous philosophies, right? What are the land and earthly teachings that indigenous philosophies bring that we can work with? Questions of reciprocity, questions of sharing, questions of mutual interdependence, right? Questions of relationality. So we begin to think of how we create communities of learners, how we see schooling as community. And we can only see schooling as community if we teach critically questions of culture, right? Knowledge, and create the space to have a conversation that allows for us to come to what Escobar talks about, a pluriverse, right? A multiple universe, right? Where we see each other as belonging. We see each other as part of it. And part of that starts with critical teachings of culture, critical teachings of cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledges are very, very important, right, for us to engage, right? Because one of the ways you subvert the dominance of Eurocentricity is to create the space for other cultural knowledges to coexist so that we can dialogue, we can contest, and we can, in many ways, reframe the way we read the world. Because you see, the late Stewart Hall, a long time ago, talked about we all come from a particular place, out of a particular history, within a particular culture, and from particular identities. This speaks about the partiality of knowing, right? It's a partiality of knowing. And feminists talked about, Donna Haraway talks about this partiality of knowing, right? And it's to recognize the importance of history, culture, identities in the way we come to know. And the only way we can teach critically is to take these notions about history, culture, knowledge, and engage them critically. That's the way we come to know and act in our world in that sense. So to me, I think I want to see, for example, how when we talk about critical teachings of culture, how we work with these notions about indigenous philosophies, about the relationship between society, nature, and culture, right? As a nexus, there's a relationship, right? That, for example, our world, we are not in our world alone. We are in our world in relationship with each other, but also with the plants, with the animals, with the seas, with the rocks, with the waters, with the rivers, with the lands. That's critically teaching about culture, right? One of the things, for example, when we talk about, say, African elders' cultural knowledges, right? I call them elder crates, African elders' cultural knowledges. When you basically interrogate these bodies of knowledge, they are talking about the relationship between culture, nature, and society. They talk about relationship between the physical and metaphysical. They talk about the relationship between humans and other living animate and inanimate objects. Because rocks, rivers, trees have life, right? And we have relationship with all of them as part of our environment. And this is so important in the way we teach about our societies.
Very important point. All right, so tell us, when stories are shared, why do you think it's important to look at the different stories from different perspectives?
Yeah. For some people, stories is all what we have. And stories are very important. But the point about stories is that it's not just simply the telling of the stories. It's how we work with the stories. So what stories do we tell, right? And how do the stories that we tell speak about ourselves, our lives, our journeys, our expectations, our aspirations? And this is why stories are so important, because stories are embodiment of our lived experiences. Stories are embodiment of our identities. Stories are embodiment of our cultures and our histories, right? And so telling those stories becomes very, very important. And that we tell those stories by raising questions about awareness, that what are the lessons of the stories that we tell? That these stories are told not for consumption, but for us to reflect and project, right? To reflect and project. And stories, right? When we tell stories, we have to ask ourselves, but what stories we tell? Whose stories do we listen to, right? How are these stories told? What is missing from these stories? These are important questions that every educator must ask. And what we take from these stories, so that they are not just simply for consumption, right? Because stories are powerful. Stories are powerful. In fact, when people tell stories, they are telling about their lived experiences. They are telling about their encounters with society, nature, and culture. When they tell stories, they are telling about the struggles. They are telling about the resistances. They are telling about their histories, right? So stories are very, very important, because stories become a very important site of interrogating ourselves, talking about our relationship with each other, knowing who we are and what we stand for and what our aspirations as we move along in this world. So stories are very, very important.
Totally agree. Stories are extremely powerful. All right. So how can we encourage, and then as an educator, how can we encourage students to share their own stories? And how is this beneficial in the learning process?
Yeah, I think it starts by not simply consuming the stories, right? It's not simply, but you see, I think stories are very important. And I think it's very important that in the school system, we allow learners to come in because every learner has a story. And so a educator, you create a space to hear the stories that our learners have. But you also create a space with a caution that you want people to hear the stories and work with the message, the text of the story, and not just simply consume it. Because people have a tendency of simply consuming the story. So somebody bears their soul, tells the story, and everything continues as usual. That is more pain. That is more injury. That can be emotionally distressful. When people bear their souls and tell their stories, they expect us to engage the stories. They expect us to relate to the stories. They expect us to ask questions about how are we implicated? How are we complicit? And what are our responsibilities when these stories are being told? Those are very important for engagement. And I think for the classroom teacher, right, it's very important to allow our students to tell the stories, but not just consume the stories, right? That when they tell the stories, let's have a critical interrogation of the stories, ask questions about what does the story tell us? How are we implicated? How do we relate to these stories? And how do we see our responsibilities as these stories are being told? So creating the space for these stories to be told and creating the stories to emotionally strengthen our learners to tell their stories is also very, very important, right? For some learners, part of their stories will be stories of resistance, stories of going through certain journeys that have been oppressive. Some of them too have to be joy, stories of joy, stories about happiness. But they are all important learning moments. And so how do we use these moments as teachable moments and engage our students to work with the stories so that we transform our communities? We transform the school space, we transform the workplace, we transform the church, we transform the streets, and we transform our communities at large. It's very, very important stories.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Powerful, powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Day.
Thank you very much for having me.